I went through and collected data from over 20 complete, unedited first playthroughs of Elden Ring. And I did it because I really wanted to make a database list of the hardest bosses in the game, focusing on the actual amount of times people died. After reviewing thousands and thousands of hours of footage, yes, I have too much time on my hands apparently, I now have a list of 25 main encounters ranked in order of death averages that I'm sharing in this video. Timestamps are in the description if you want to skip around, but first, there's some information you should know before diving into the list. The concept of difficulty in games is a moving feast that changes over time, I think. After a new FromSoft game is released, metas get discovered, things are buffed and nerfed, and bosses that might have previously been a challenge become trivial. Because of this, I chose to focus on mostly blind first playthroughs as close to release day as I could. It's easy to forget what the game was like when no one knew anything about it, and I like to think of first playthroughs as being the best examples of what I call organic difficulty, where gamers play the game naturally, exploring and building their characters in different ways without knowing what's ahead. This also means that each average death counter mentioned in this video reflects average first time deaths, not average deaths after having already beaten the game. I looked at mostly big streamers as they were the ones who tended to put large chunks of unedited stream footage online, and honestly this made my job a lot easier, but I did my best to include data from small streamers as well to balance things out. It is worth mentioning that this list looks purely at death data and completely disregards how cinematic or important to the story a boss is. It's also worth mentioning that the 25 bosses I've listed in this video are what I consider to be the 25 main encounters in Elden Ring, based on having now looked at thousands of hours of footage. It's not an exact science, but there are just too many bosses for me to collect data on, so I just have to narrow it down. Some entries on the list are common sense, as they're story critical, unskippable bosses for example. However, other encounters made it onto the list because they both posed a significant challenge to players and were fought at similar power levels across most playthroughs. The Tree Sentinel is a good example of this. It's a missable, non-story critical boss. However, most people either did it before or after Margit, and almost everybody did it before leaving Limgrave, so it counted. But now that that's out of the way, let's get started. At the very back end of the list is Lich Dragon Fortisax, coming in with the lowest average death count of 0.4. It feels like Fortisax is an early/mid-game boss that most people fought right at the end of the game, which was enough to make it the easiest on this list by quite a way. To get to Fortisax, you not only need to have reached the Deeproot depths, but you must have progressed Rani's questline far enough to acquire the curse mark needed to complete Fia's quest. On first playthroughs, players just didn't have all this until well into the late game, at which point they were strong enough to butcher the Lich Dragon. This is a shame because it's an end of quest boss that has some interesting unique attacks. However, across my dataset, Fortisax was a boss that looked much harder than it ended up being. Taking spot 24 is Loretta, Knight of the Halig Tree, with an average kill count of 2.1. Considering this boss is the precursor to Millennia, it's surprising to see it so low, but the numbers speak for themselves. Next up at number 23 is Golden Godfrey, with an average death rate of 2.3. With a few significant outliers removed, this boss does drop to a 0.91 death rate, which would put it lower than Loretta. I left all outliers in, but most players scored double donuts on this boss, that being 0 summons, 0 deaths, so there isn't much more to say. At numbers 22, 21 and 20, we have Renala, the Gargoyle Duo, and the Red Wolf of Radagon, scoring 3.4, 3.5 and 3.8 respectively. It's worth mentioning that almost everybody in my dataset went for a melee build first time round, which absolutely diced through Renala, and I did the same thing on my first run. However, on my second run using magic, I did find it more difficult and even learned that if she stays alive long enough, she will summon dragons. Who knew? At number 19, we have the easiest Godskin encounter, that being the Godskin Noble, which averages out at 4 deaths. The dataset that I have for this boss is one of the smaller ones, as many people missed the Godskin Noble in favour of completing the Volcano Manor questline to access Rykard. However, the numbers being what they are, places this boss here. Now we have the only shared position on this list, Dragon Lord Placidusax, at least I think that's how you say it, and Astel Natural Born of the Void both have an average death count of 5.4, which, in my view, is surprisingly low, as these both felt like high effort bosses. Almost all streamers commented that Placidusax's arena was incredible, and I honestly think that looking around the arena for the Red Lightning Storm is the coolest boss mechanic in the game. although I do remember only dying a handful of times as well on my first run. Taking spots 16, 15 and 14 are the Fire Giant, Draconic Tree Sentinel and Praetor Rykard with 6, 6.2 and 7.3 average deaths. Before I looked at my dataset, I would have placed the Fire Giant higher on this list, as I definitely died more than 6 times here. I was also surprised to see Praetor Rykard make it into the top 15, as gimmick bosses in FromSoft games have typically been on the easier side. Coming in at number 13 is a rather surprising one, Commander Nile. Standing at the top of Castle Sol, Commander Nile claimed 9.1 deaths on average in the dataset. Although I didn't record death data related to actually getting to the boss fight, I can tell you that the Banished Knights roaming the area slaughtered a lot of people trying to disrespect them by running past. Next up is the first Shard Bearer encounter for most players, Godric the Grafted, with an average death rate of 9.4. We are now also into the territory of noteworthy performances by streamers. In my dataset, the speedrunner Elijah's had the best performance on this boss by having only 2 deaths and 0 summons. Moving on to number 11, we have Morgott, who boasts an impressive average death count of 9.5. Shout out to Asmongold, Elijah's and Lobos Jr., who walked away from their first playthrough scoring double donuts on this boss. Morgott definitely took me more than 10 tries, so well done to anybody who put this guy down in fewer than 9 deaths.
What's the second phase?
Just scraping the top 10 is another surprising entry, the Kaled variant of the Godskin Apostle. This boss has an average death rate of 12.5 and nobody scored a death donut in my dataset. I had serious trouble with the Apostle Skin Bro at the bottom of the Kaled Divine Tower on my first run, so I was glad to see that nobody found him to be a pushover. I was also worried that the Kaled Godskin Apostle would be too hidden to qualify as a main encounter, but to my surprise, people actually found this boss pretty easily. At number 9 is everybody's favourite Fell Omen, putting foolish ambitions to rest since release day, Margit. Margit carries a death rate of 12.8 in my dataset, and I can tell you that Asmongold had the best performance out of everybody I watched, with 4 deaths, 0 summons, beating out all of the players who did summon as well. Staying in Limgrave for another position on the list, we have the Tree Sentinel with an average death rate of 13.1. Hats off to Squilla Killer, who destroyed the Tree Sentinel straight out of the gate with no deaths and no summons, claiming the sole double donuts for this boss, which is a coveted prize among my 18 subscribers. Next up at number 7 is the Godskin Duo with a hefty death rate of 14.6. One thing I can tell you about this boss is that it was very polarizing in that you either cracked it or you didn't. With Outliers removed, the Skin Bros could be sat at a death rate of 6.2, but the people who got stuck here really did get stuck. Asmongold, Distortion 2 and Elijah's all did the double donuts on the duo, with Distortion 2 killing them in a whopping 64 seconds using Meteorite of Astel. On top of that, the kill would have been even faster if he didn't have to wait for a respawn. Just left out of the top 5 is everybody's least favourite nonce, Mog, Lord of Blood. This is the biggest single jump in death rates between positions that we've seen so far. Across my dataset, Mog comes in at an average 18.1 death rate. In terms of best performances, we have Elijah's again with 6 deaths and no summons. Stamping his way into the top 5 with the big boys and girl, we have Godfrey / Horaloo with a serious average death rate of 20.5. Yes, his golden projection may have more donuts than I can count in the dataset, but the real Godfrey proved a much bigger challenge and is the first boss to break the 20 average death mark. This boss wasn't a challenge for Distortion 2, however, who only died twice with no summons. Hats off also to Moist Critical, who came a close second with 3 deaths, no summons. Claiming a solid 4th position is the boss that I'm fairly confident was my number 1 on my first playthrough, Star Scourge Radahn. He comes out with a death rate of 21.3, but I would caveat that by reminding people he was nerfed shortly after release, and the nerf at the end of March had an accidental over-nerf effect that wasn't corrected until April 4th, I believe. If I had the energy to go and only count the deaths pre-nerf, Radahn may very well be higher. Now, I know what you're thinking. How can I expect to reach the dizzying heights of 20 subscribers if I'm not willing to investigate the patch every player in my dataset was on when they killed Radahn? Well, I tell you what, if you ask nicely in the comment section, I just might. But regardless of Big Red's nerf rollercoaster in the early days, across the playthroughs I looked at, he still stands strong with a 21.3 death rate. This is even more impressive when you consider the fact that the game allows players to summon en masse against him. Across my dataset, Otzdava did this boss with only 3 deaths, which is the lowest number I recorded, though Squiller Killer had the lowest no summon deaths at 6. Position number 3 goes to Malekith, the Black Blade. I didn't struggle too much with this boss during my first run, but I can tell you Malekith boasts a very impressive 21.9 death rate. Distortion 2 had the best overall performance with 2 deaths and 1 summon, but hats off once again to Asmongold, who had the best no summon death rate with 4 deaths. At this point, Asmongold was still using the nerfed Golden Halberd, which I recorded him as having used for every boss apart from the Tree Sentinel, which is of course the boss that drops that weapon. Occupying the runner-up position for the hardest encounter in the game is the Radagon and Elden Beast fight, which took 22.2 deaths on average to beat. The fact that this fight is so high on the list will not come as a surprise to many due to it both being the final encounter of the game and the fact that it's a 2-stage gauntlet. Notwithstanding the average, Elijah's once again had the best performance on record with 6 deaths and 0 summons, followed very closely by both Distortion 2 and Asmongold with 7 deaths, 0 summons each. Now, before I move on and talk about the number 1 spot on this list, I want to very quickly mention a boss that could have taken the number 2 spot and could have bumped everything else down had I not discounted the data. And that's the Crucible Knight and Misbegotten Warrior gank boss that came out of nowhere in the stats with a whopping average death rate of 23. However, this was the most missed boss across all the playthroughs I looked at. On a first playthrough, streamers only really found this boss if they came here before starting the Radahn Festival, which means coming here pretty early. And because the game was so new, a large number of streamers didn't return after Radahn because they didn't know it had been missed. On top of that, a lot of the very good players didn't do this boss, and so I felt that my sample size was too small to justify letting it kick every boss apart from number 1 down a peg. Just know though that this boss was very difficult and likely would have occupied a spot in the top 10 if enough people had done it. And finally, the number 1 spot. You probably knew the number 1 spot before clicking on this video, but I don't think anybody will be prepared for just how far she stands out from the crowd. Malenia, Blade of Miquella, sits as the queen of this list with a staggering 169.8 average death rate. With 1 significant outlier removed, this jumps to 188.5. That outlier belongs to Distortion 2, who only died 1 time while fighting Malenia. He used a double greatsword build and admittedly used a mimic summon on his successful 2nd attempt. However, I saw plenty of summon strats that went over the average, so regardless of the technique, Distortion 2's performance is the best I recorded by far. The best 0 summon kill that I recorded came from Moist Critical, who died to Malenia 33 times, beating her on his 34th attempt with a double katana build. To boot, this wasn't just the best 0 summon performance I recorded, but also the 2nd best performance period with summon strats included. Alright, thanks for watching. This took me ages to put together, so if you're feeling nice, you could leave a comment, let me know whether or not it was worth it. You should bear in mind that most of this data came from professional gamers, so don't worry if you died a lot more. I certainly did. Now, go beat Malenia in remembrance of the people that took over 400 attempts.